The air was thick with the kind of stillness that only small towns could muster. Samuel Johnson walked the familiar streets with a slow, deliberate pace, his cane tapping gently on the sidewalk. He tipped his hat to Mrs. Green, who waved back from her porch, a smile creasing her wrinkled face. "Morning, Sam," she called. "Good morning to you, too, ma'am," he replied warmly, his deep voice carrying a weight of decades lived in this same town. To everyone here, Samuel wasn't just a man. He was a figure of history. He had been the backbone of this community, fighting for rights in the face of opposition, attending every town hall, mentoring the lost and the forgotten. But today, he was just Samuel, heading to the grocery store, like any other day. The town might have changed. New buildings had risen, and some of the faces were no longer the same. But for Samuel, the rhythm of the place remained. He smiled to himself as he thought about how much had stayed the same. Halfway down Maple Avenue, Samuel noticed a squad car parked on the corner, the white and blue of the police lights muted in the morning sun. He didn't think much of it. He had seen patrols like this his whole life. The town had its share of minor crimes, nothing too serious. But something felt off today. As he turned the corner, the young officer stepped out of his car. Travis Monroe, his badge gleaming in the light, his uniform pressed and immaculate. Samuel noticed him from the station, though they'd never spoken. A recent transplant to the town, Travis didn't have the friendly disposition that most officers here shared. There was a tension in his posture, an edge that Samuel had seen before in young men trying to prove themselves. Travis stood in the middle of the sidewalk, blocking Samuel's path. "Sir," Travis called out, his voice sharp. Samuel slowed his steps, looking up at the officer with calm curiosity. "Morning, officer. Something wrong?" Samuel asked, his voice polite but cautious. He shifted his weight slightly, leaning on his cane. "There's been a report of a robbery near here," Travis said, eyeing the small bag Samuel carried with suspicion. "I need to ask you a few questions." Samuel frowned, but he nodded. "Well, I've just been to the store, got some milk and bread. That's all," he said, lifting the bag slightly to show its contents. Travis's eyes narrowed. He wasn't hearing Samuel. He was assessing him. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, where his gun rested. "Mind telling me where you're coming from?" Samuel straightened, his calm exterior unshaken. "From the supermarket, officer. Same place I go every Tuesday." His eyes locked with Travis's, unblinking. "You can check with them. They know me." Travis's jaw tightened. He looked past Samuel, as if expecting something, anything, that would justify his suspicion. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside and let me search you," Travis said, his voice lower now, as if trying to control his irritation. A few passers-by had stopped on the other side of the street, watching the interaction unfold. Samuel noticed them out of the corner of his eye. He sighed, tired already of what he knew was coming next. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm a veteran of this town, been here my whole life. I'm not a part of whatever it is you're looking for." Travis's hand gripped his baton. "Sir, this isn't a debate. I'm giving you a lawful order. Step aside now." There was a shift in the air. Samuel could feel it, the way things could turn from civil to ugly in the blink of an eye. He had lived through enough to know when someone wasn't seeing him, when they were seeing something else entirely. Samuel stood his ground, his voice still soft, but firm. "I'm not stepping anywhere. I've told you what I'm doing here." That was all it took. In one swift motion, Travis pulled Samuel's arm behind his back, his other hand pressing Samuel against the wall of the corner store. The bag of groceries fell to the ground, the milk carton bursting open, white liquid spilling across the sidewalk. The crowd on the street gasped. A woman pulled out her phone, starting to record. Hey, what the hell is going on here?" someone shouted. Samuel grunted as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. His head turned, trying to find Travis's eyes. "You're making a mistake, son," he said quietly, but Travis didn't hear him. He was too deep in it now, too caught up in the heat of the moment, the adrenaline. "Stay quiet, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he barked. Across the street, Mia Carter, a lawyer who had just finished a morning jog, stopped in her tracks. Her heart dropped as she saw Samuel pressed against the wall, his wrists bound. She knew this man. He had been like a father to her growing up, a mentor who had guided her when she didn't know which way to turn. Without thinking, she crossed the street, her feet pounding against the pavement, her voice rising above the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "Officer," she called, her tone sharp and authoritative. "Let him go. Now." Travis looked up, his grip on Samuel loosening slightly. "Stay back, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." Mia stopped just a few feet away, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. "It concerns me when an innocent man is being manhandled in the middle of the street. That man is Samuel Johnson, and he's not involved in any robbery." The crowd around them grew, phones held high as they recorded the unfolding scene. Mia could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, on Travis, and especially on Samuel, who remained silent but dignified. Travis hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Ma'am, I said stay back." Mia stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "I'm a lawyer, and if you don't release him right now, I'll make sure you regret every second of this." For a moment, the world seemed to hang in the balance. Travis's hand hovered over his holster, but then he glanced around at the crowd, at the cameras, and at Mia's steely gaze. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back, releasing Samuel's arms. Samuel stood up straight, his shoulders aching from the strain, but his expression calm. He glanced at Mia, offering her a small, grateful nod. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, filled with concern. Samuel smiled weakly. "I'm fine, child. Just tired." As the crowd began to disperse, whispers of the incident already spreading through the town like wildfire, Mia stayed by Samuel's side, helping him gather his groceries. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward Travis, who was now back in his squad car, staring at the two of them with a cold, unreadable expression. "No," Samuel agreed, his voice low but resolute. "It's just beginning." The wind had changed. It wasn't just the air that felt different, but the town itself seemed to have shifted after what had happened to Samuel. Word spread quickly, faster than anyone could have expected. The video of his arrest had already racked up thousands of views online. The once sleepy town was buzzing, and Samuel's name was on everyone's lips. Mia sat in Samuel's small living room, her fingers tapping against the armrest of the worn-out couch. She glanced over at Samuel, who was staring blankly out the window, lost in thought. "I can't believe it's come to this," Mia finally said, her voice breaking the thick silence that had settled between them. "Samuel, we need to talk about what's next. That video is spreading like wildfire, and people are starting to take sides." Samuel sighed, his shoulders heavy. "I'm too old for this, Mia. I fought these battles before, decades ago, and I thought—" His voice trailed off as he shook his head slowly. "I thought maybe we'd made some progress." Mia leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "This is different. We can use this. Your voice, your story, it's powerful. People are already rallying behind you. You could inspire them." Samuel turned to face her, his expression softening. "Inspire them to what, Mia? More anger? More division? I've lived long enough to know how these things end. A lot of noise, a lot of shouting, and nothing changes." "That's where you're wrong," Mia said sharply, her voice tinged with frustration. "People are listening, Samuel. They want justice for you, and they're looking to you for guidance. We have to do something before this gets out of control." Samuel looked at her, his face etched with a deep weariness. "And what do you suggest we do?" Mia opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. The sudden sound startled them both. Samuel slowly pushed himself up from his chair and moved toward the door, his steps heavy. He opened it cautiously, revealing a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a tense expression. It was Sarah Monroe, Travis's mother. Samuel's face tightened at the sight of her, and Mia rose to her feet, her body stiffening with tension. "Sarah," Samuel said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. "What brings you here?" Sarah glanced around the room nervously, her eyes lingering on Mia for a moment before she finally spoke. "Samuel, I don't know where else to turn. I need to talk to you. Mia stepped forward, her voice cold. You think now's a good time for a conversation, after what your son did? Sarah flinched at the harshness in Mia's tone, but Samuel raised a hand, calming her down. Let her speak, he said, his voice steady. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I'm not here to defend Travis. What he did, it was wrong. I know that. But he's my son, Samuel. He's my only child. I can't just sit by and watch his life fall apart. Samuel's eyes darkened, his voice low. And what about my life, Sarah? What about the lives of every black man in this town who has to deal with the kind of treatment your son dished out? You expect sympathy? Sarah shook her head quickly, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I don't expect sympathy. I just want to understand what's happening. This isn't the boy I raised. He wasn't like this before he joined the force. Something's changed in him. Mia folded her arms, her gaze unyielding. What's changed is that he's part of a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. He's not the first cop to abuse his power, and he won't be the last unless we do something about it. Sarah looked at Mia, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right. Samuel took a step closer to her, his voice softening, though his pain was still evident. There's no fixing what's already been done. Your son's actions, they hurt me, Sarah. But they also hurt this community, and they hurt you. The question is, what are we going to do now? Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. I'm begging you, Samuel. Don't let this tear the town apart. Travis, he's not handling this well. I'm afraid of what he might do if this keeps escalating. Mia's expression hardened. Your son made his bed. Now he has to lie in it. You should be more worried about the damage he's already done. The room fell silent again, the tension thick between them. Samuel finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. Sarah, I'm not looking to destroy your son. But what happened to me? It can't be swept under the rug. Justice needs to be served. For me and for every other person who's been wronged. Sarah nodded slowly, her face pale. I understand. As she turned to leave, Samuel's voice stopped her. I'll pray for him, Sarah. And I'll pray for you too. She glanced back, her eyes full of sadness, before slipping out the door. As the door clicked shut, Mia turned to Samuel, her expression frustrated. I don't know how you can be so calm. She's part of the problem, Samuel. She raised him. She let this happen. Samuel sat back down heavily, his hands resting on his knees. People are products of their environment, Mia. Sarah's been through her own battles. I don't condone what her son did, but I can't let hatred fester in me either. That's not who I am. Mia shook her head, pacing the room. I know you're trying to be the bigger person, Samuel, but this is more than just about you. This is about a system that's broken. You have to fight. Samuel looked at her, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that came from years of enduring. And I will, Mia, but we fight the right way. Not with more hate, but with truth and justice. Just then, Mia's phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with notifications. She picked it up, her eyes widening as she saw the messages flooding in. Samuel, the video. It's gone viral. News outlets are picking it up. There's already talk of protests, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. Samuel nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. Then we need to be ready. Across town, Travis sat in the dimly lit living room of his small apartment, staring at the television. The local news was playing clips of the incident, replaying the moment over and over. He watched as his own face filled the screen, watched himself slam Samuel against the wall, watched the horror in the old man's eyes. His hands clenched into fists. This isn't me, he muttered under his breath. But the truth was, deep down, he knew it was. He had lost control, let the pressure of the job, the expectations, the constant fear of not being good enough, get to him. But none of that excused what he had done. The phone rang on the table beside him. He didn't have to look to know it was his mother. He had ignored her calls all day, too ashamed to face her, too angry to deal with the fallout. He let it ring. Instead, he stood up and grabbed his jacket, heading out the door without a second thought. He needed air. He needed to think. As he walked through the quiet streets, his mind raced. What had he become? The job was supposed to give him purpose, supposed to make him feel like he was doing something good. But now all he felt was shame, and a gnawing sense that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Back at Samuel's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. Mia was still pacing, her mind working overtime, trying to figure out their next move. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, more to herself than to Samuel. "The media's going to twist this. They'll paint Travis as the victim if we're not careful. We need to make sure the truth gets out." Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. "I trust you, Mia. You'll know what to do." Mia stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really think we can win this?" Samuel smiled softly. "It's not about winning, Mia. It's about doing what's right. If we stand for that, then we've already won." The weight of his words hung in the air as the last rays of sunlight faded away. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Samuel sat at the front, his hands resting on his lap, calm but resolute. Next to him, Mia Carter rifled through a stack of papers, her expression focused and sharp. They were ready, or as ready as they could be. "Samuel," Mia whispered, leaning toward him, "today's going to be tough. They're going to try and discredit you, paint you as just another angry black man." Her voice was firm, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, but we've been through worse, haven't we?" Mia smiled softly, though the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Yeah, we have. But it doesn't make this any easier." The doors to the courtroom opened, and in walked Travis Monroe. His eyes briefly met Samuel's before darting away. Travis was visibly more gaunt than the last time Samuel had seen him. His once confident stride was now hesitant, and his face was pale. He sat down next to his lawyer, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together on the table. There was a moment of silence that stretched across the room, as if everyone was holding their breath. "Do you think he feels guilty?" Mia asked, her voice just above a whisper. Samuel didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on Travis, who was nervously adjusting his tie, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "I don't know," Samuel finally said, "but I'm not sure it matters anymore." The first hour of the trial dragged on with procedural formalities, but tension hung thick in the air. The prosecutor called Samuel to the stand, and all eyes turned to him as he rose slowly, making his way with the dignity that had defined him for decades. He took his seat at the witness stand, briefly locking eyes with Mia, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "Mr. Johnson," the prosecutor began, "can you walk us through what happened on the day of the incident?" Samuel took a breath, recalling the events with precise clarity. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I was walking to the store, like I do every Tuesday. Travis Monroe stopped me. At first, I didn't understand why, but I figured it was just a routine check. I explained where I was coming from, but he wouldn't listen. Things escalated fast, too fast." The prosecutor nodded. "And did you provoke Officer Monroe in any way?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, sir. I answered his questions, told him who I was. But that didn't matter. He wasn't interested in my answers." As Samuel continued his testimony, describing in detail the moment Travis had slammed him against the wall, the courtroom remained silent. The tension was palpable. Travis sat stiffly at his table, his eyes glued to the floor. When Samuel finished, the prosecutor turned to the defense attorney, a sharp-faced man who had been scribbling notes furiously. He stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached Samuel. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his tone deliberately neutral, "I want to make sure we have the facts straight. You were carrying a bag that day. Is that correct?" Samuel nodded. "Yes. Groceries. And you were coming from an area where there had been a reported robbery, correct?" Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. "I wasn't aware of any robbery. I was just doing my shopping." The lawyer pressed on. "But you fit the general description that the police had received, didn't you? A black man in the area with a bag?" The words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Mia tensed, her hand clutching a pen so tightly it threatened to snap. Samuel met the lawyer's gaze, his voice cool. I suppose I did. The lawyer smirked slightly, sensing an opening. So, in fact, Officer Monroe had reason to suspect you. You admit you matched the description of the suspect. Samuel didn't flinch. He had a reason to ask me questions, but not to throw me to the ground. The lawyer took a step closer, his voice lowering. And you resisted, didn't you, Mr. Johnson? You didn't comply with the officer's instructions. Samuel's jaw tightened. I never resisted. I didn't have a chance. Across the room, Travis sat in silence, his hands still trembling as he listened. The words echoed in his head. I never resisted. And for the first time, he began to feel the full weight of those words. He had convinced himself for weeks that he had acted out of necessity, that the situation had spiraled out of his control. But sitting there, hearing Samuel recount the events, something inside him began to break. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something, but Travis barely heard it. His mind was far away, replaying that day over and over again. The moment when Samuel had looked at him, confusion in his eyes, the way his body had hit the ground with a thud. Travis shook his head, trying to clear the memories, but they wouldn't go away. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could defend himself. During the recess, Mia paced the hallway outside the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Samuel sat on a nearby bench, watching her with an amused expression. You're going to wear a hole in the floor, he joked, but Mia didn't smile. We're losing this, Samuel, she said, her voice low but urgent. They're twisting everything, making you look like the aggressor. Samuel's face softened. It's not about winning or losing, Mia. It's about the truth. And we've spoken the truth. Mia's frustration bubbled over. But the truth isn't enough. Not in a system that's designed to protect people like Travis. Samuel stood, moving slowly but purposefully toward her. You've fought hard, Mia. You've done everything you could. But sometimes, we just have to trust that the truth will rise above all the noise. Mia shook her head, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. It's not fair, Samuel. You deserve better than this. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Fairness isn't something we've ever been guaranteed in this life, child. But justice, that's something we fight for. Mia took a deep breath, nodding, though the fire of her frustration hadn't dimmed. We'll see, Samuel. We'll see. As the trial resumed, the defense called their first witness, Travis Monroe. There was a palpable shift in the courtroom as Travis slowly made his way to the stand. His once confident demeanor had all but evaporated, replaced by a heavy weight that seemed to drag him down with every step. He sat down, glancing nervously at the jury, then at Samuel, whose calm, unwavering gaze met his. The prosecutor wasted no time. Officer Monroe, the lawyer began. In your own words, explain to the court what happened that day. Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry. There was a call about a robbery. I was in the area, and when I saw Mr. Johnson, I assumed he was involved. The prosecutor leaned forward. You assumed? Travis nodded, his voice weak. Yes. I thought he matched the description. And then, the prosecutor pressed. Travis hesitated, his gaze dropping to his lap. I tried to question him, but things escalated. I thought he was resisting. A silence fell over the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. The prosecutor's voice was softer now, almost a whisper. And was he resisting, Officer Monroe? Travis didn't answer right away. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but the entire room was focused on Travis, waiting for his response. No, Travis finally admitted, his voice barely audible. No, he wasn't. The courtroom gasped. Mia's heart leapt in her chest, her eyes widening in shock. Samuel remained still, though a flicker of surprise crossed his face. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice firmer now. So, Officer Monroe, if Mr. Johnson wasn't resisting, why did you escalate the situation? Travis ran a hand through his hair, his voice cracking. I don't know. I panicked. I made a mistake. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Everyone waited for what would come next, but the weight of Travis's words hung in the air, undeniable and irreversible. Later that evening, After the trial had adjourned for the day, Samuel and Mia walked out of the courthouse together. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. "He admitted it," Mia said, her voice full of disbelief. "He actually admitted he was wrong." Samuel nodded slowly. "It doesn't change what happened, but it's a start." Mia looked at him, her eyes full of questions. "Do you think that'll be enough?" Samuel sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but for the first time, it feels like we might be on the right path." The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Samuel sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. The judge had just called for a brief recess, but the tension was still palpable. Samuel could feel the weight of the case on his shoulders, but he remained calm, steady, like he always had. His eyes moved slowly over to where Travis sat, hunched over, his face pale. The admission from earlier echoed in his mind. Travis had admitted that Samuel hadn't resisted. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something like hope. But Samuel knew better than to assume victory so soon. Mia approached Samuel as the judge left the room, her expression a mix of relief and wariness. "We made progress today, but it's not over yet. They'll come back hard after this," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know," Samuel replied, his eyes never leaving Travis, "but I didn't expect him to admit it." Mia crossed her arms, pacing in front of him. "Neither did I. It's a crack, but we need more. They're going to pull out every excuse in the book, and you know it. The defense will use everything they can to shift the blame." Samuel let out a slow breath, nodding. "I've fought worse battles, Mia. We'll get through this." Mia gave a small, tired smile. "You're right. We've come too far to let them turn this around now." In the hallway outside the courtroom, Travis leaned against the cold wall, feeling a pit forming in his stomach. His lawyer was standing nearby, speaking in a low, urgent tone, but Travis wasn't really listening. His mind was still stuck on his testimony from earlier, on the words he had spoken. He had admitted the truth, but what had that gotten him? Would it make things worse? Or was it the first step toward something better? His phone buzzed in his pocket. He knew who it was without looking. His mother had been calling him relentlessly, ever since the trial began, trying to offer support. Travis hadn't answered a single call. Finally, he pulled the phone from his pocket, staring at the screen. He could almost hear her voice through the silence. "Travis, just talk to me." The guilt gnawed at him, and before he could stop himself, he answered. "Mom," he said quietly. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Sarah's voice, soft but relieved, broke through. "Travis, I've been worried sick. Are you okay?" Travis didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked up to the ceiling, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to burst. "No, Mom, I'm not okay." There was a deep sigh on the other end of the line. I know this is hard, but you did the right thing, admitting what happened. It's the only way this is going to get better." Travis closed his eyes, the words, "the right thing," clashing in his mind. But what if it doesn't get better? What if this just ruins everything? His mother's voice grew more urgent. "Son, listen to me. You're in a dark place right now, but you can't let this consume you. You're not beyond redemption. You can still make this right." Travis felt the weight of her words, but he wasn't sure he believed them. "I don't know how to make it right anymore, Mom." "You start by owning up to what you did. You've already taken that first step, but it's not enough just to admit it. You need to understand why it happened, what made you do this in the first place." There was silence between them, as Travis's thoughts churned. "I was scared," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't cut out for this job. I wanted to prove myself, and I made a mess of it." His mother's voice softened. "You're not alone in that, Travis. But being scared isn't an excuse for what happened. You need to own that fear and make sure it never happens again." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I know. And Travis," she added, her voice a bit shakier now, "I love you, but you have to face the consequences. No more running from this." Travis felt his heart drop, but he knew she was right. "Yeah, Mom. I know." Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Mia was preparing her next steps. She stood near the window, watching as more protesters gathered outside. The crowds had swelled in recent days, signs held high, voices demanding justice. It was a powerful sight, one that gave her a renewed sense of purpose. "You see them?" Samuel's voice cut through her thoughts. Mia turned, nodding. "Yeah, I see them. More people are showing up every day. It's becoming bigger than this trial." Samuel smiled softly. "It was always bigger than this trial. I just hope it leads to something real." Mia looked back out at the crowd. "It will. People are finally listening." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes tired but hopeful. "You know, I've seen so much of this in my life. Fought against it. But this, it feels different. Like maybe something's shifting." Mia's expression softened. "It is different. And you're the reason for that, Samuel." Samuel gave a small chuckle. "I'm just an old man trying to live his life in peace. I didn't ask for any of this." Mia smiled, shaking her head. "You never asked for it, but you're handling it better than most." Samuel's face grew serious. "It's not about handling it, Mia. It's about doing what's right. And what's right doesn't always feel good. You know that as well as I do." She sighed, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, I know." As the courtroom filled again, Travis took his seat, feeling the weight of his mother's words. His lawyer sat beside him, preparing to continue their defense, but Travis's mind was elsewhere. He looked over at Samuel, sitting calmly with Mia beside him. The dignity that Samuel carried struck him, more now than ever before. How had he become the man who could strip someone like Samuel of his dignity? The realization hit Travis like a tidal wave, crashing over him with overwhelming force. The defense began, questioning Travis's state of mind during the incident, painting him as a man overwhelmed by stress and fear. But as the words echoed through the room, Travis found himself barely able to listen. It all felt like excuses he wasn't willing to make anymore. Suddenly, Travis stood. His lawyer shot him a panicked glance, whispering harshly, "What are you doing?" But Travis didn't sit back down. Instead, he turned to the judge, his voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your Honor, I'd like to say something." The courtroom stilled, all eyes now on him. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "This is highly irregular, Officer Monroe. Are you sure you want to do this?" Travis nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sure." He turned to face Samuel, his throat tightening. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know how to make up for what I did. I don't know if I ever can. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I put you through. You didn't deserve any of it." Samuel looked at him, his expression unreadable, but he didn't say a word. The courtroom was dead silent, the tension thick in the air. Travis's voice faltered, but he continued. I acted out of fear and ignorance. I wasn't thinking about you as a person, and that's on me. I'm not here to make excuses. I just want to say that I'm sorry, and I'll accept whatever consequences come from that." The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, the weight of Travis's words sinking in. Samuel's gaze never left him, but he remained silent, his face unreadable. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to the present. "Officer Monroe, your words will be noted, but we still have a trial to conclude." Travis nodded and sat back down, his body trembling slightly as the reality of what he had just done settled in. Mia leaned over to Samuel, her voice soft. "What do you think?" Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on Travis for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "I think he's starting to understand, but words aren't enough." Mia nodded. "No, they're not, but it's a start." As the day wore on, the trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The defense had lost some of its momentum, and there was a sense that Travis's confession had struck a chord with more than just the people in the room. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their voices carrying on the wind, a force that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the jury filed back in. Outside, the crowd had swelled to hundreds, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice. Inside, it felt like the world had stopped. Samuel sat in the front row, his hands resting on the cane he didn't need, but always carried. Mia was beside him, her eyes sharp, ready for whatever was about to come. Travis sat just a few feet away, his face pale and hollow, as though the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. "All rise," the bailiff's voice cut through the quiet, and everyone stood as the judge re-entered the room. Samuel's heart thudded in his chest, steady but loud, like a drumbeat that echoed through his entire body. He exchanged a brief glance with Mia. She gave him a nod, small, but enough. This was the moment they had waited for, the culmination of everything that had happened since that fateful day. The judge took his seat, his expression unreadable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with a serious face, holding a small piece of paper in his hand. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, waiting. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat. "On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Travis Monroe, guilty." A ripple of noise ran through the courtroom. Travis's face crumbled as the words sunk in. His lawyer leaned in to speak with him, but Travis didn't seem to hear. The weight of his guilt, something he had only just begun to fully grasp, now settled over him like a lead blanket. Samuel remained still, his face calm. He hadn't come here for revenge. He had come here for truth. And now that truth had been spoken, Mia let out a slow breath beside him, her body relaxing slightly, though the tension still lingered in her shoulders. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to Samuel. But Samuel didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the clattering of voices as the room erupted into conversations. His gaze was locked on Travis. "Order in the court!" The judge banged his gavel, his voice loud, but controlled. "I will now move to sentencing. Officer Monroe, please stand." Travis rose shakily, his legs barely supporting him. His once proud, rigid posture was now bent, his head lowered in shame. The judge's voice was steady. "In light of the jury's verdict, and taking into account your previously unacknowledged misconduct, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in a state correctional facility with eligibility for parole after 3 years served." The sentence hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Travis's mother, Sarah, who had been seated near the back, gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Travis didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if the weight of everything had rendered him speechless. The judge stood, signaling the end of the trial, and the room slowly began to disperse. Mia turned to Samuel, her voice soft. "It's done." Samuel nodded slowly, but he didn't feel the triumph Mia seemed to. "No," he said quietly, his eyes still on Travis. "It's just beginning." Later that evening, Samuel and Mia sat in a quiet diner across town. The noise of the trial, the voices of protest, all of it seemed distant now. The waitress poured them both cups of coffee, the clinking of the cups the only sound between them for a while. Mia broke the silence first. "You don't seem relieved." Samuel stirred his coffee slowly, watching the swirl of cream mix with the dark liquid. "Relieved? No, I'm not. What happened today was justice, but it's not peace." Mia frowned, leaning forward. "But he was found guilty. He's going to prison. Isn't that what we wanted?" Samuel met her eyes, his expression filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from living through decades of hardship. "What we wanted, Mia, was change. And change doesn't come from sending one man to prison. Change comes when people learn from their mistakes, when they start to see the world through different eyes." Mia sighed, sitting back in her chair. "I know you're right, but it still feels like a victory." Samuel nodded, his face softening. "It is in some ways. But we can't stop here. There's more to do. More people to reach." Mia's phone buzzed on the table, pulling her attention away. She glanced at the screen. More messages, more media requests. The case had become a national conversation, and Mia was now in the center of it all. "I'm going to need your help, you know," she said, looking up at Samuel with a smile. "This is far from over." Samuel chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You're the one with the fire, Mia. I'm just the old man with the stories." Mia shook her head, her eyes sparkling with determination. "You're more than that, Samuel. You're the reason people are paying attention. You've inspired a movement." Samuel sighed, his eyes drifting to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were fading into twilight. "I didn't ask to inspire anyone. I just wanted to live my life in peace." "And you will," Mia said firmly. "But first, we have to make sure that peace is possible for everyone else." Across town, Travis sat in a holding cell, waiting for transport to the state facility. His hands were cuffed, resting in his lap. He felt empty, like the world had been drained of color. The reality of his sentence hadn't fully hit him yet. Part of him still couldn't believe this was his life now. An officer of the law, convicted and sent to prison. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see his mother, Sarah, standing on the other side of the bars, her face pale and worn. "Travis," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Travis couldn't meet her eyes. "I messed up, Mom." Sarah nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I know, baby. I know." There was a long silence between them, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on both of them. "I don't know how to fix it," Travis whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can." Sarah stepped closer, her hands gripping the bars tightly. "You start by accepting what you've done, and then you have to find a way to make it right. I don't know how, but I believe you can." Travis finally looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "I'm scared, Mom." Sarah reached through the bars, placing her hand on his. "I know, baby. I know." As the weeks passed, the town slowly began to settle back into its rhythm, but the trial had left its mark. Conversations about race, justice, and accountability had become part of daily life. The protests hadn't stopped, but now they were more organized, more focused. Samuel, true to his word, became a central figure in the town's growing movement for racial equality. His quiet strength and steady leadership drew people to him, and soon, he found himself speaking at rallies, sharing his story with people who had never understood the depth of what it meant to live as a black man in America. At one such rally, held in front of the courthouse, Mia introduced him to the crowd. "This man," she said, her voice ringing out across the square, "is not just a victim. He's a leader. And we have him to thank for the progress we've made. But we're not done yet. This is just the beginning." Samuel stepped up to the microphone, the crowd falling silent as he spoke. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he began, his voice calm but powerful. "But sometimes, life doesn't give us a choice. What happened to me was wrong, and I'm glad that justice was served. But justice isn't the end of the story. Justice is just the beginning. It's what we do next that matters." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes locked on him. "We can't just sit back and say that this one trial was enough. It's not enough. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep educating. Not with anger, but with purpose, with love for one another and a commitment to change." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew that, this time, they were moving in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.